The airplane doors opened slowly, letting in the last few passengers who had been waiting at the gate. The air inside was filled with a mix of quiet conversations. The sound of bags being lifted into overhead bins, the steady hum of the aircraft's engines preparing for the journey ahead. First class was calm and bright, the seats wider, the space larger, and the atmosphere quieter than the rest of the plane. It was a place where people came expecting comfort, silence, and exclusivity. Big Shaq walked down the aisle, carrying himself with a calm and natural confidence. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and strong, his red sweater bright against the pale blue tones of the cabin. His smile was wide and genuine, not forced, and his eyes reflected a man at peace with himself. As he moved toward his seat, people noticed him not because of noise or disruption, but because of his presence. He had an aura that drew attention, the kind of presence that could fill a room even if he said nothing at all. He placed his small carry-on in the overhead bin with ease and lowered himself into his seat. The leather chair almost seemed small under his frame, but he sat comfortably, his smile never fading. For Big Shaq, this was not just another seat on another flight. It was a quiet reminder of the long journey he had taken in life. He had worked, hard-faced struggles, and earned his place in that very seat. To him it was more than comfort, it was a symbol of dignity. The cabin around him was calm. A woman in a navy blue flight attendant uniform moved gracefully through the aisle, checking tickets and helping passengers settle in. Two businessmen in suits were already typing on their laptops, lost in emails. An older woman with pearls around her neck read a magazine quietly. Everyone seemed ready to settle in for the flight. But then, the quiet atmosphere was broken. An older man with sharp features and a tailored navy suit approached. His steps were quick, his jaw tight, and his eyes sharp with irritation. He stopped, right in front of Shaq's seat, his hand gripping the headrest. And his voice cut through the calm air like a blade. "Move," he barked. "You don't belong here." The words echoed louder than the engines outside. Passengers lifted their heads in surprise. Some froze, unsure what to do. The flight attendant who had been walking down the aisle stopped instantly, her eyes wide with shock. Shaq looked up at the man, his smile still resting gently on his face. He did not respond right away. Instead, he studied the man's expression, his narrowed eyes, the tightness in his mouth, the finger that pointed at him like a weapon. Shaq had seen this kind of reaction before in his life. It was not about the seat, it was not about the plane. It was about something deeper, something unkind. The old man's voice grew sharper. "Do you hear me? This section isn't for people like you. Move before I call someone." His words were not just loud, they carried arrogance, the kind that comes from years of believing comfort belongs only to a few. The passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to get involved, yet no one could look away. The silence in the cabin grew heavy, like air before a storm. The flight attendant tried to step forward, but her voice caught in her throat. She glanced at Shaq, hoping he would not respond with anger. Shaq leaned back slightly in his seat, his shoulders relaxed. Took a slow breath. Not because he was angry, but because he wanted to respond carefully. Smile remained, though. Softer now, less about joy, and more about calm strength. He said nothing yet, but inside his mind, memories began to stir. Times when he had been told he could not sit somewhere. Times when doors had been closed in his face. Times when voices had told him he did not belong. Each memory was a test, and each time he had chosen to rise above. He was not about to let this moment be any different. The old man's finger was still pointing, sharp and shaking. His voice grew louder, hoping to win the attention of others. "Do you see this?" he said to no one in particular, turning his head toward the other passengers. "This is what happens when rules aren't respected. People think they can just take what isn't theirs." But the passengers did not nod. They did not agree. Instead, many of them looked away, their discomfort plain on their faces. They knew the man's words were wrong, even if they did not speak up. A quiet tension filled the air. Finally, Shaq lifted his head, his deep voice steady and calm. "Sir," he said slowly, "I am in the right seat. This ticket is mine. It belongs exactly where I am sitting." His words were not loud, yet they carried weight. His calm tone made them stronger. than any shout could have been. The flight attendant, emboldened by his composure, stepped closer, ready to confirm his seat and his place. The old man blinked, taken aback by Shaq's calmness. He had expected anger, maybe shouting, maybe even a confrontation. But instead, he was met with dignity. Shaq's response was not defensive. It was firm, respectful, and unshaken. The cabin was silent now. Every passenger watched, waiting for what would happen next. Some felt inspired already by the strength in Shaq's calm reply. Others were silently rooting for him, admiring how he held himself with dignity in the face of insult. The old man's lips curled into a sneer. He was not done yet. "People like you," he muttered, shaking his head, "is always thinking you can buy your way into places you don't belong. Money doesn't make you fit in." His voice was sharp, bitter, dripping with resentment. But Shaq only leaned back again, his smile returning faintly. He said nothing more at that moment. His silence was not weakness, it was power. He knew the strength of patience, the strength of waiting for the right moment to speak. The flight attendant finally stepped forward, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. "Sir," she said firmly to the old man, "this passenger is in his rightful seat. Please take your seat and allow us to prepare for takeoff." Her words did not just defend Shaq, they defended dignity. They defended the idea that belonging is not decided by prejudice, but by truth. The old man's face tightened, but his voice faltered. For the first time, he realized he was standing alone. No one clapped for him. No one supported him. The silence of the passengers spoke louder than his insults. Shaq remained calm, his smile steady, his eyes gentle. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to prove himself with anger. His very presence, his very calmness, was proof enough. And in that quiet cabin, in that charged moment, everyone began to feel that this was more than an argument about a seat. This was a lesson unfolding right before their eyes. The engines outside the plane hummed like a steady drumbeat. Yet inside the cabin the air felt heavy, as if all the oxygen had been pulled into silence. Passengers looked down at their hands, their magazines, their phones, pretending not to notice the storm rising in the aisle. But everyone noticed. They had seen the old man lean forward with his sharp finger and spit out words of dismissal at Big Shaq. They had heard the venom in his voice when he said that Shaq did not belong. And now, even though the flight attendant had spoken up, even though Shaq himself had answered with calm dignity, the tension had not dissolved. It lingered like smoke after a fire, reminding everyone that sometimes words carry more weight than fists. Shaq sat still in his seat, his broad frame steady, his smile quiet. He was not smiling to mock, not smiling to pretend, but smiling because he knew himself. He had learned long ago that a man's worth is not defined by another man's anger. He had learned that insults often reveal more about the one speaking than the one listening. And yet, even with all his strength, he could feel the sting. Words like, "You don't belong here," cut deeper than people admit. They carry memories of old battles, of doors closed in faces, of times when respect was withheld simply because of how a man looked. The older man in the suit had not sat down yet. He stood in the aisle, his voice low now, but still sharp enough for Shaq to hear. "I've seen this before," he muttered, not even realizing how many people were listening. "People who think money is enough, but class is not bought, cannot sit among us simply because you paid for a ticket." His words were coated in arrogance, and though they came out quietly, they spread across the cabin like cracks in glass. The two businessmen in the back exchanged uncomfortable glances, while the woman with pearls pressed her lips together. No one agreed with him, but no one spoke. Shaq took a deep breath. His chest rose slowly, his eyes focused not on the man's finger, but on the view outside the small oval window. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with thin clouds, endless, open, untouched by human prejudice. He thought about how strange it was that up there, above the earth, above borders and walls, people still carried the same chains they made for themselves on the ground. He thought back to his younger days. He remembered the first time someone had told him he could not enter a place because of who he was. He remembered being turned away, his money refused, his presence treated as a disturbance. At the time, it had cut deeply. But he had chosen not to shrink, he had chosen to grow. Every insult had become fuel. Every barrier had become a reason to climb higher. And here he was now, seated in first class, not because of luck, not because of favors, but because of his own sweat and persistence. That was why he sat calmly. He did not need to defend himself with rage, when his life itself was the answer. The flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes that now looked troubled, tried again. "Sir, I must ask you to sit down," she said to the old man. "We are about to take off, and we cannot continue until all passengers are seated." Her voice carried both professionalism and quiet pleading, because she did not want this moment to escalate further. But the old man shook his head, his pride louder than reason. "I will sit when this is corrected," he said. "Hey, this section is for those who earned it." His words stopped there, his mouth tight. But the meaning was clear. Shaq finally turned back, toward him, his eyes steady. His voice was low, almost gentle, but every syllable carried weight. "Ah, sir," he said, "I earned my seat the same way you earned yours. Through work, through effort, through discipline. The ticket in my hand proves it. I do not need your permission to belong." The words struck differently than the man expected. They were not shouted. They were not defensive. They were calm, certain, and deeply true. Some passengers lifted their eyes from their laps and looked at Shaq with quiet respect. They had been silent before, but now they were witnesses to something greater than a seat dispute. They were watching what it meant to hold on to dignity when someone tried to strip it away. The old man scoffed, but his voice was weaker now. He muttered about how times had changed, about how standards had fallen. But even he could feel the shift. The more Shaq spoke with calmness, the smaller his own anger felt. He had entered the moment thinking his words had power, but now he realized his words only made him look bitter. Shaq leaned back, resting his hands on the armrests. He knew the man's prejudice was not his burden to carry. He knew that anger would not change him, but patience might teach those watching. He thought about all the younger eyes in the cabin, children peeking from seats, teenagers glancing nervously from behind headphones. What lesson would they learn if he responded with anger? What lesson would they carry if he responded with peace? So he smiled again, not forced, not mocking, but with the quiet strength of someone who knows his worth. The truth, he thought, to himself, does not need to be shouted. The flight attendant finally placed a hand on the old man's arm, her voice firmer this time. "Please, sir, you must take your seat now. You cannot delay any longer." The old man glared at her, then at Shaq, but something in his eyes had changed. He was not winning. The passengers were not supporting him. His words were not piercing. As he hoped, standing there, trembling with his own pride, he realized he was not exposing Shaq. He was exposing himself. Slowly, reluctantly, he moved back toward his seat. The cabin exhaled, as if the pressure had finally eased. The businessmen returned to their laptops. The woman with pearls reopened her magazine. But their eyes still carried the story of what they had seen. Shaq sat still, his head tilted slightly. Toward the window again. The sky was still there, endless and wide. He thought about how often life tests people in small moments, not with battles, not with wars, but with words. Insults, judgments, dismissals. Those are the battles most people face in silence. And the way you answer them becomes your strength. For him, this was not just about a flight. It was about proving once again that dignity is not handed out by others. It is built within, and no insult, no prejudice could take away what he had already earned. Asterisk, the airplane had settled into an uneasy quiet after the old man finally lowered himself into his seat. But the silence was not one of peace. It was the kind of silence that lingers after a storm, when everyone is still waiting to see if the thunder will return. Shaq remained still in his chair, his large frame calm and unshaken, his eyes resting once more on the view outside the window. He had not moved much during the confrontation, and that very stillness carried a kind of strength the others could feel. In a world where people so often fought noise with more noise, Shaq had chosen something different. He had chosen silence, patience, and dignity. But even silence carries weight when it is chosen with purpose. The man in the navy suit sat a few rows away now, his face turned toward the aisle, but his body language betrayed his frustration. He shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath, unable to let go of the bitterness he had carried into the cabin. It was clear that he had not accepted the moment's outcome, but the fire in him had dimmed. His words no longer cut through the air with the same sharpness. He had shouted, and in return he had been met not with equal fire, but with calm certainty. That calmness unsettled him because it revealed the weakness of his anger. Shaq knew this. He understood that sometimes the most powerful response is not to fight, but to refuse to be moved. He remembered the countless times in his past when he had been tested in similar ways, when others had tried to draw him into conflict with their insults. In his younger years, it had been tempting to respond with the same energy, to prove himself through confrontation, to fight back with words as sharp as those thrown at him.
Ow.
But time had taught him that anger rarely heals and pride rarely wins. What truly wins is control over one's own spirit. To stay calm in the middle of insult is to show strength that cannot be shaken. The passengers around him were learning that lesson now. A man across the aisle glanced at Shaq with quiet admiration. A young woman further down the cabin whispered softly to her companion, noting how unusual it was to see such composure in a situation that could have turned chaotic. Even the flight attendant, who had been caught between duty and discomfort, looked at him now with relief and gratitude. She knew how icily this moment could have escalated, how quickly tempers could have burned out of control. But because Shaq had chosen calm, the situation had been softened before it became unmanageable. The old man's words still echoed in Shaq's ears. "You don't belong here." It was not the first time he had heard such words, and he doubted it would be the last. They came from strangers, from doubters, from those who believed they could measure a man's worth with their own narrow standards. But Shaq had long ago decided that belonging is not given by others. It is claimed by the life one builds, the work one does, the character one shapes through struggle and perseverance. He leaned back, resting comfortably in his chair. He felt no need to prove himself further because his entire life had been proof. He remembered the early mornings of training, the late nights of sacrifice, the times when no one believed in him but himself. He remembered the challenges that had knocked him down, the failures that had tempted him to quit, and the voice inside that had told him to rise again. Every moment of discipline, every ounce of effort had carried him to the point where he now sat in this seat. And that seat was more than leather and metal lit, was a symbol of how far he had come. Passengers might not know his story, but they could see his strength. They could see that his calm response was not weakness, but power, the kind of power that does not shout, but speaks in steady truth. Shaq finally turned slightly in his seat, his deep voice carrying gently across the aisle. "We all belong where our effort takes us," he said, not just to the man who had insulted him, but to everyone within earshot. His words were simple, but they carried a message that pierced the quiet air. Yes, belonging is not about who grants you permission. Belonging is about the steps you take, the sacrifices you make, and the person you become along the way. The man in the suit shifted again, uncomfortable under the weight of those words. He wanted to reply, but he could not. The truth in them was too clear. It was not an argument. It was a reality he could not erase. Round them, passengers began to nod slightly, some looking at Shaq with respect, others reflecting inwardly on their own journeys. For many of them, the words stirred something personal. Everyone had faced moments of doubt, moments of being told they did not belong. To see someone respond with such grace gave them courage, gave them a reminder that dignity is stronger than insult. The flight attendant, her voice steadier now
Leaned toward Shaq.
"Thank you for your patience, sir," she whispered, her eyes soft with appreciation. Shaq nodded with a smile. He did not need thanks, but he understood the weight of moments like this, not just for himself, but for everyone watching. Life often delivers lessons in unexpected places. Sometimes in schools, sometimes in workplaces, and sometimes on a flight 30,000 feet above the earth. For Shaq, this was one of those moments. He had turned an insult into a lesson, not by force, not by anger, but by showing the strength of calm. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the cabin returned slowly to its ordinary rhythm. The businessmen went back to their typing. The woman with pearls folded her magazine neatly, and a child 2 rows ahead peeked back at Shaq with wide eyes full of wonder. Shaq smiled gently at the child, and in that small exchange, another lesson was passed on, the lesson that strength and kindness can exist in the same man. The engines roared louder now as the plane began to move down the runway, but inside, a different kind of journey was already happening. Each passenger carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed. Some carried it as inspiration, some as reflection, but all carried it as a reminder that even in small moments, greatness can shine through. And for Shaq, sitting quietly in his seat with his calm smile, it was not about proving the old man wrong. It was about proving once again that the strongest response to hate is dignity. And the truest measure of belonging comes from within. Asterisk, the plane was finally in the air, climbing through the clouds with a steady hum, but inside the cabin the tension had not fully lifted. People sat in their wide first-class seats, sipping water or adjusting their seat belts. Yet their thoughts were not on the flight. They were still replaying the scene they had just witnessed. An insult thrown like a dagger, a calm reply that turned the weapon back on its sender, and a silence that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Most of the passengers wanted the moment to end there, sealed quietly as an example of dignity and restraint, but the man in the navy suit was not finished. He sat stiff in his seat, his jaw clenched tight, his pride bleeding into every thought. His mind would not allow him to accept what had happened. In his view, he had been challenged and exposed, and pride is a dangerous companion when it feels cornered. The flight attendant had moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts and closing overhead bins, yet her eyes flicked back nervously at the suited man. She could sense the storm was not fully gone. The passengers around him could sense it too. They avoided his gaze, but they felt the bitterness radiating from him like heat. He shifted, he muttered, and finally, as the plane leveled off high above the earth, he leaned forward again. His voice was quieter this time, but it cut just as sharply. "Why people like you think one calm word makes you equal," he said, toward Shaq, not caring that others could hear. "You sit here as if discipline and effort erase history. But class is not about tickets. It is not about money. It is about knowing your place." A few passengers stiffened in their seats. The woman with pearls lowered her magazine again. 2 businessmen exchanged glances, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The young child who had been peeking back at Shaq turned quickly toward his mother, sensing the air grow heavy again. The old man's words crawled through the cabin, like shadows, unwanted and unkind. Shaq did not turn immediately. He stayed as he was, his eyes on the endless sky stretching outside the window, a sky that did not ask who belonged. He let the silence sit for a moment, because silence can sometimes expose ugliness better than any argument. Only wait when he felt the weight of every ear listening did he finally lean back slightly and turn his head. His voice came steady, calm, and full of quiet conviction. "Sir, I know my place," he said. "It is wherever my hard work carries me. It is wherever my persistence allows me to sit. And it is certainly here, because this seat was earned with effort, not given by favor." The words rolled through the cabin like waves, soft but unstoppable. They carried no anger, only truth. And truth, when spoken with calm certainty, often leaves no room for reply. Yet the old man's pride would not let him stop. He sneered, his voice low but bitter. "Hard work," he muttered. "Everyone talks about hard work. But some people never understand that hard work is not enough. There are doors that stay closed no matter how much you knock. Some things are meant to remain separate. That is the way of the world." His words revealed more than he realized. They revealed not confidence, but fear. They revealed not wisdom, but bitterness that had grown roots in his heart long ago. The passengers heard it, and they knew. The more he spoke, the less powerful. he seemed. His attempt to tear down another man was only showing the cracks within himself. Shaq leaned forward now, not in anger but in presence. His eyes locked with the old man's, and his voice deepened with meaning. "Doors do not open for those who stand outside complaining about who enters," he said. "Doors open for those who build the strength to walk through them. I have faced closed doors all my life, and I chose not to turn back. I chose to push forward until I found the ones that would open. That is why I sit here. That is why I belong. And no words of yours can change the truth of what I have earned." The cabin grew still again. Passengers who had tried to look away found themselves watching now, unable to ignore the strength in Shaq's reply. Some nodded subtly, others smiled faintly, as if the words spoke to battles they themselves had faced in their own lives. It was no longer just a conversation between two men. It was a lesson being given to everyone present. The old man tried to reply, but his mouth closed before the words could form. He turned his head away, staring at the aisle as if searching for escape. For the first time, he seemed smaller. Pride had demanded a fight, but the fight had been taken from him, not by force, but by calm truth. He could not win against a man who refused to be moved. Shaq sat back again, his smile gentle, his posture steady. He did not gloat, he did not smirk, he did not seek victory. To him, this was not about defeating another man, it was about holding his own dignity, about showing that calmness is the greatest shield against insult. He knew that those watching had learned something tonight, not just about him, but about themselves. They had seen that belonging is not about appearance, it's not about old ideas of separation, but about the effort and persistence that build a life. The engines hummed steadily outside as the plane cut through the clouds, but inside, a different kind of journey was taking place. Passengers who had once felt like silent witnesses now carried a story inside them, a story they would remember and share. The story of a man who was insulted but did not fall, who was tested but did not break, who chose calm over anger and truth, over pride. The flight attendant returned with a tray of drinks, her steps lighter now, her smile more certain. She handed Shaq a glass of water with a quiet thank you in her eyes. A thank you for keeping peace in a place where peace is easily broken. Shaq accepted it with a nod, raising the glass slightly before taking a sip. To him, the water tasted like more than refreshment. It tasted like victory, not the kind of victory that shames another, but the kind that reminds a man he is still true to himself. The old man remained silent now, his bitterness burning quietly within, but his power in the cabin was gone. The attention no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the man in the red sweater who had shown everyone that the calmest voice is often the strongest. And as the night sky unfolded outside the window, endless and dark, yet full of stars, Shaq knew that this flight was more than just a journey across miles. It was a journey across lessons, one that had given everyone on board something they did not expect to take home. The hours in the sky stretched slowly. But no one had forgotten the words spoken earlier. The tension of the confrontation lingered like an echo, yet what remained stronger was the memory of how Big Shaq had answered. Calmness had carried more power than insult, and though the man in the suit had tried to fight back with bitterness, his words had only made him look smaller in the eyes of everyone around. For most passengers, the argument might have seemed finished, but for Shaq, the lesson was still unfolding. Life had a way of testing people again and again until the truth was undeniable. The man in the navy suit sat in his chair, stiff and restless, his pride still pressing on him like a heavy weight. He had come into the flight certain of his authority, certain that he could shame another man with a few sharp words. But instead of weakening Shaq, his insults had only revealed his own bitterness. He could feel it in the way other passengers no longer looked at him with respect, in the way the flight attendant avoided his gaze. Pride has a way of refusing to surrender, and though he stayed quiet, his eyes still burned with resentment. Shaq, on the other hand, leaned back in his seat with ease. His smile was faint but real, a reflection not of victory, but of peace. Was not interested in humiliating anyone. He was interested in holding on to his dignity, and in showing by example that true strength is not measured by how loudly one shouts, but by how firmly one stands without raising a hand. He glanced around the cabin and noticed the quiet stares that passengers gave him. Some looked at him with admiration, some with gratitude, and some with a kind of wonder, as if they had never seen someone stand so tall without moving from his seat. The turning point came when the silence itself began to speak louder than the old man's insults. People realized that Shaq had not only defended himself, he had defended them too, because everyone in that cabin had at one time or another felt out of place. Everyone had been told in some way that they did not belong. And in watching Shaq refuse to bend, they saw a reflection of their own struggles. His calmness was not just his, it was a lesson for all. The flight attendant moved down the aisle with a softer expression now. She poured coffee for the businessmen, offered juice to the woman with pearls, and finally reached Shaq's row. Her hands were steady, her eyes calm. When she handed him his drink, she leaned slightly closer and whispered, "Thank you for showing strength in the right way." Her words were not meant for everyone, but a few passengers nearby overheard, and they nodded quietly. It was as if the whole cabin had agreed on something unspoken, that what they had seen was not ordinary, it was remarkable. The man in the navy suit shifted again, unable to sit in comfort. He wanted to say something, to claw back some control, but his voice had lost its edge. Every attempt at arrogance now felt hollow, and so for the first time in many years, he stayed silent, stewing in thoughts he would never speak. He realized that his words had failed him. The man he had tried to belittle had become the center of quiet respect, while he himself had become a shadow in his own battle. That realization weighed heavier than any insult he could throw. Shaq took a sip of his drink, his eyes resting on the window again. Outside, the night sky stretched wide and endless, scattered with stars, a reminder that the world was larger than any one man's anger. He thought about all the people in his life who had doubted him, all the obstacles that had once seemed immovable. He thought about the voices that had told him no, and how he had turned each no into another step forward. This moment on the plane was just another test, another reminder that belonging comes not from approval, but from perseverance. The turning point was not only for the old man, it was for the passengers too. One of the businessmen closed his laptop, reflecting quietly. He'd built a career chasing respect. But seeing Shaq handle insult with calmness made him question how he carried himself when challenged. The woman with pearls pressed her magazine closed and thought about the times she had stayed silent when she should have spoken up. Even the child 2 rows ahead peeked back again, his young eyes wide with admiration. For him, the lesson was, perhaps the most important, that strength is not about fighting louder, but about standing taller in silence. Shaq knew he could not control the old man's bitterness, but he could control himself. And in doing so, he had already shifted the cabin. What had begun as an insult had become a stage for dignity. What had started as an attempt to shame had turned into a lesson that no one in that cabin would forget. This was the turning point, not in the argument, but in the hearts of those who witnessed it, as the plane cut steadily through the dark. The air inside grew calmer. Passengers leaned back, some with faint smiles, some with thoughtful silence. Shaq's calm response had changed the atmosphere. The old man, once so loud and certain, now sat isolated in his own pride, while the rest of the cabin quietly sided with the man in the red sweater. Respect had shifted, not because Shaq demanded it, but because he lived it. The turning point was clear. The insult had failed. The attempt to push a man down had instead lifted him higher. And though no applause filled the cabin, the silence was filled with something stronger: understanding. Understanding that every person in that cabin had witnessed what it meant to rise above insult with dignity. Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the hum of the engines carry him into thought. He knew life would always have voices like the one in the navy suit, voices that doubted, voices that judged, voices that tried to exclude. But he also knew that strength is not found in silencing those voices. It is found in refusing to let them decide your worth. And in that simple truth, the turning point of the flight had been sealed. The steady rhythm of the engines filled the night as the plane moved smoothly across the dark sky. Carrying with it more than passengers and luggage, it carried a story. Now, A story that everyone in the first-class cabin had become part of, whether they wanted to or not. An insult had been thrown, bitterness had been shown, and yet what lingered stronger than the sting of those words was the calmness with which Big Shaq had answered them. It was not a fight of fists or shouts, but of dignity against arrogance, composure against pride. And as the flight continued, something subtle began to shift inside the cabin. The man in the Navy suit, who had once commanded attention with his sharp tone and loud accusations, now sat quieter than ever before. His shoulders slumped slightly, his eyes restless, his fingers drumming against the armrest, as if trying to hold on to a confidence that had already slipped away. He had expected to dominate the moment, to humiliate another man and win the silent approval of those around him. But instead, he had been met with calm resistance, and in that calmness he had been exposed. His words had not weakened Shaq. They had weakened him. Around him, the passengers had grown braver in their silence. At first, they had avoided eye contact, fearful of being caught in the middle of a dispute that did not involve them. Their glances carried quiet admiration, directed not at the man in the suit, but at the one who sat peacefully in his red sweater, his face calm, his voice steady. They had seen strength before, but not like this. This was not the kind of strength that rises with volume or force. This was the kind that stands firm without needing to move, the kind that wins not through shouting but through presence. Respect is not something that can be demanded, cannot be forced or bought. It is earned through action, through the way one carries himself when tested. And in that cabin, respect had slowly shifted from one man to another. Shaq had not asked for it. He had not tried to take it. But the passengers gave it to him freely, because they recognized something true in him. The woman with pearls leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "He handled it better than anyone I've ever seen." Her voice was low, but Shaq, with ears trained to notice even the smallest details, caught the words. He did not turn, did not acknowledge, but the faint smile on his lips grew warmer. He was not smiling for victory. He was smiling because he knew the truth respect is strongest when it is given freely.
I'm not.
Demanded. One of the businessmen who had been tapping on his laptop earlier closed the lid now. He looked across the aisle at Shaq and nodded, not with words, but with a small gesture of acknowledgement. It was the kind of nod men give when they recognize something powerful in another, something worth admiring. Shaq returned the nod slightly, his calm eyes showing gratitude. It was not about winning over an audience. It was about staying true to himself, and in doing so, earning the kind of respect that lasts. The child 2 rows ahead peeked back again, his wide eyes fixed on Shaq as if looking at a hero from a storybook. His mother noticed and whispered for him to turn around, but the boy lingered a moment longer, as if he wanted to remember the image of the man who had faced insult without flinching. For that child, the lesson would last longer than the flight. He had seen what strength really looked like, and he would carry that lesson into his own life someday. The flight attendant, who had been forced into the uncomfortable role of mediator earlier, now moved through the cabin with more confidence. She stopped by Shaq's seat, offering him a refill of his drink, her smile brighter than before. "You set an example for everyone here," she said softly, her voice carrying both gratitude and relief. Shaq accepted the drink with a polite nod, not needing to answer. His example had already spoken louder than any reply could. Meanwhile, the man in the suit sank deeper into his own silence. Every attempt he had made to tear Shaq down had only built him higher in the eyes of others. The respect that had once been assumed his by default had slipped away, and he could feel it. He felt the coldness of being ignored, the sting of being seen not as strong, but as bitter. And that realization gnawed at him more deeply than any insult could. Shaq did not gloat. He did not smirk. He did not look at the man with triumph. Instead, he looked at him with the same calm eyes he had held from the beginning. Because respect is not about humiliation, is not about standing over another. It is about standing firmly within yourself, no matter what storms try to shake you. And that was the lesson everyone was learning from him tonight. The respect in the cabin grew silently, like a tide that rises without anyone noticing at first. A shift in posture, a change in glances, a softening in the air. People sat a little. Taller, breathed a little deeper, as if they too had absorbed some of the calmness Shaq carried so easily. It was as if his composure had spilled into the cabin, reminding everyone that dignity is not fragile, that calmness can be stronger than fire. Respect had been earned, not with shouting, not with anger, but with stillness. And as the plane continued its journey across the night sky, the passengers carried that respect with them. It was no longer just about one man's seat in first class. It was about what he had shown, that even in the face of insult, dignity can shine, and that respect, once earned in truth, can never be taken away. The long hours of the flight drifted on, but the memory of what had happened earlier stayed alive in every mind. The insult, the sharp finger pointed with arrogance, the heavy silence that followed, and finally the calm response from Big Shaq. Of it had woven itself into the journey, turning an ordinary flight into something unforgettable. It was not the kind of story people expected to witness while sitting in wide leather seats high above the clouds. It was not about the food served, or the comfort of the cabin, or the luxury of first class. It was about character, about dignity, about what it means to hold your ground when someone else tries to push you down. The cabin had grown peaceful now. The man in the navy suit who had started the conflict sat sunk into his seat, his face turned away, his presence smaller than it had been at the start of the journey. His voice, once loud and arrogant, had disappeared into silence. Ash! He had lost, not because Shaq shouted louder, but because Shaq had refused to fight in the way he wanted. There is a kind of defeat that comes not from being shouted down, but from realizing your words have no power. And that is what he felt now, Shaq. On the other hand, sat quietly, his hands resting on the armrests, his gaze often drifting toward the window. The night sky stretched endlessly, dark and wide, with stars scattered across it like promises. He thought about how strange it was that up here, 30,000 feet above the earth, where the world seemed small and borders invisible, people still carried prejudice in their hearts. But he also thought about how every insult, every doubt, every moment of dismissal could be turned into a lesson, not just for himself, but for those watching. That was what gave him peace. The passengers were not the same as they had been when they boarded. Something had shifted in them. The two businessmen who had been typing away on their laptops had closed their screens long ago, quietly reflecting on what they had seen. They thought about how they carried themselves in meetings, how they spoke to people they believed beneath them, and they felt a sting of shame. The woman with pearls who had kept to her magazine earlier now looked at Shaq often, her expression thoughtful, as though she was questioning her own silence in moments when she could have stood up for others. The child 2 rows ahead, who had peeked back at Shaq more than once, now stared openly, his eyes wide with admiration. For him, this was a story he would tell for years. A story about the man in the red sweater who showed that strength is not about fists or anger, but about calmness and truth. The flight attendant, moving gracefully through the aisle, felt it too. She carried the drinks with more ease now, her smile more genuine, her heart lighter. Earlier, she had feared a scene that might escalate, feared losing control of the cabin. But now she realized something powerful. Sometimes peace is not kept by rules or authority. Sometimes peace is kept by the example of one person who refuses to be shaken. She would remember that long after this flight. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his voice low but steady, as he spoke again, not just to the man in the suit, but to the entire cabin. The truth is simple, he said. Belonging is not given by someone else. Belonging is earned by how we live, how we work, how we rise after being pushed down. No insult, no judgment can take that away from you. The only person who decides whether you belong is you. His words floated through the cabin like a soft current, touching every ear, sinking into every heart. Some passengers nodded subtly, others closed their eyes to absorb it, but all of them felt it. They had not expected to receive wisdom on a flight, yet here it was, given freely, spoken not in anger but in truth. The man in the suit shifted slightly, his jaw tight, but he did not speak. He could not. He had no answer to truth. The more he sat in silence, the more he realized how his attempt to insult had backfired. He'd wanted to show power, but in doing so, he had revealed weakness. He'd wanted to strip another man of dignity, but instead, he had handed him more respect than he could ever take away. Pride can keep a man stubborn, but even pride knows when it has lost. The cabin exhaled together, a shared relief that the storm had truly passed. The hum of the engines became the soundtrack of calm, the quiet reminder that life continues to move forward even after storms. Some passengers closed their eyes to rest. Others returned to their books or magazines, but the energy was not the same. They carried something new with them now. They carried a story, a reminder, a lesson that dignity and perseverance outshine arrogance and hate. Shaq closed his eyes too, but not out of weariness. He closed them to reflect, to let the peace of the moment settle within him. He had not chosen this confrontation, but life rarely asks before it tests. What mattered was how one responded. Tonight, he had responded in the only way he knew by. Standing tall in calmness, by letting truth be his answer, that was enough. Hours later, when the plane began its descent, the passengers stirred awake. The city lights glittered below like stars on the ground, and the captain's voice came through the speakers with steady instructions. People gathered their belongings, folded their magazines, closed their laptops. But as they prepared to leave, they could not stop glancing at Shaq one last time. Some smiled at him, some nodded, some simply held his image in their minds. They would carry this story with them into their own lives. When the wheels touched the runway and the plane slowed to a crawl, the journey felt complete. Not just the physical journey across the sky, but the inner journey each passenger had taken. They had boarded with expectations of comfort, food, and perhaps sleep, but they were leaving with something far greater. They were leaving with a lesson that belonging is not permission given by others, a lesson that calmness can defeat arrogance, a lesson that true strength is quiet, steady, and unshakable. As the doors opened and passengers began to leave, the child who had watched, Shaq, with such awe, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "when I grow up, I want to be strong like him." His mother smiled softly, her eyes warm as she looked at Shaq. "Then remember what you saw tonight," she replied. "Strength is not in shouting. Strength is in standing tall." Shaq rose from his seat, lifting his bag from the overhead bin with ease. He walked down the aisle slowly, not rushing, his presence still commanding without effort. Passengers stepped aside politely, some offering quiet nods of respect, others whispering words of admiration. He accepted them all with the same calm smile he had carried since the beginning, and as he stepped out of the plane, into the bright lights of the airport, the lesson followed behind him, carried by every passenger who had witnessed it. The insult had faded, the bitterness had dissolved, but the dignity remained. What had started as a moment of disrespect had ended as a story of respect earned. A reminder that even in the most ordinary places like the cabin of a plane extraordinary, lessons can unfold. The night air outside was cool, the world noisy again with the sounds of travelers and announcements, but within Shaq there was only peace. He had faced another storm, and once again he had risen above it. And in doing so, he had not only strengthened himself, he had lifted others too. That was the true victory. That was the lesson in the sky.